When I got a letter telling me that my name had been removed from the records of the church, I thought it would feel liberating, because up to that time, it had felt that way. I felt like I was doing something big. Once I got the letter telling me that I was no longer a member of the church, I actually felt really deflated.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Saints Unscripted podcast. And we're really excited for our viewers and our listeners today because we're still in the faith crisis season. And we have Don Bradley back again. Really excited. If you remember, we had him talk about his book, The Lost 116 Pages, Reconstructing the Book of Mormon's Missing Stories. And today we're going to talk about faith crisis. So I know that you have a story. If you could talk a little bit about that, about your journey there, and feel free to, be as open or not open as you want. I know our listeners can benefit a lot from hearing about your story.
Sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, it's been kind of a circuitous journey and certainly a very unexpected one at every turn, really. So yeah, and I am now an ex-Mormon. But I started out as very devout. My parents were both converts. I was just kind of a good Latter-day Saint kid. I had a kind of spiritual awakening when I was 15, and really started thinking more about the importance of spiritual things. And I mentioned in the other podcast that we did, but I'll go into it a little bit for those who didn't hear that, maybe because it's relevant to this story. My first doubts came about in like a really ironic, unusual way. It was family home evening, and my dad, for our activity, took us to Deseret Book and offered to buy us each a book of our choice. So there in the general authority section, right, between Boyd K. Packer and Joseph Fielding Smith, I found B.H. Roberts' books, and I was familiar with him, that he'd been a general authority a long time before, and was really solid. And so when I saw this book by him called Studies of the Book of Mormon, it just looked fascinating, I didn't know the history of it, and neither did, apparently, the buyers at Deseret Book, because this book was never intended for publication. This is a manuscript he had written decades earlier. He had lived decades earlier. He had written decades earlier, and it was really like his devil's advocate case against the Book of Mormon, so that defenders of the faith could preempt certain challenges to the Book of Mormon. Like he was laying out a case that he knew others might come and lay out later, so that, Latter-day Saint scholars could figure out, well, how are we going to deal with this?
And he wasn't very specific about putting his belief in there, right? It was mainly just like a journal maybe of him.
No, it wasn't a journal, and it wasn't like his beliefs either. It was him compiling evidence to try to make an argument that the Book of Mormon wasn't historical and Joseph Smith could have written it.
Okay.
So he was trying to see, what kind of case could I build for this? Right.
That's probably not found at Deseret Book anymore, right?
Nope. I'm probably the only teenager in the entire church who bought this at Deseret Book, because it shouldn't, I'm sure it wasn't there for long before somebody figured it out. Right.
Get these books out of here.
Realized, why are we selling this again? But I read it. I got it for family evening, right? I read it. And I was just blown away. Up until that point, for me, Nephi had been as real as George Washington. I had no more questioned the reality of the one than the other, But it threw open for me the question of, the truth of the Book of Mormon. And then if that was up in question, then what about Jesus? What about God? What about life after death? And just I had lots of doubts and fears when I was 17, And I grappled with that for a while. I managed to sort of come to a place of relative peace after a while. But it actually got me started doing a research into church history. I encountered that. I encountered other weird things from the history of the church, around the same time. And so I started, my family just kind of serendipitously moved to Salt Lake from Utah Valley. And I was within easy distance from the bus on the bus to go down to the church archives in downtown Salt Lake. And it was even close enough I could walk, really,
Cool.
So all that summer, between 11th and 12th grade, right after we moved, I went down every day in my shorts and was researching things like the history of the atom God theory and like all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And stuff about the Book of Mormon. This is how I really got into Mormon history. And then after school, I went to East High. After school, I would take the bus down, and research there. And
That's cool.
I had questions. Sometimes those questions were more in the forefront of my mind, sometimes more in the back of my mind. But I came to a pretty good place with things. I went on a mission to Houston, and came back from my mission and kind of picked up a lot of the questions again. Started researching more into church history. And the thing that really fascinated me, the thing that increasingly I started to zero in on was all things Joseph Smith, right? The origins of the church. I'm interested in anything that I get interested in its origins. This was no exception. I loved my faith, and I was very into that. And so I wanted to know kind of where it came from. And Joseph Smith, because this history wasn't just any history, this was sacred history, right? And Joseph Smith, he was like the revelator par excellence, right? You look at the scripture, you look at the canon, Latter-day Saint canon, and how much of it's revealed through any given prophet. And there's Isaiah has a size, pretty big book, bigger than almost any of the other prophets. But then Moses has, a huge amount attributed to him, right? Well, then Joseph, the amount that comes through Joseph Smith is massively beyond Moses, right? It's bigger than anybody. So I thought, if I want to understand more of the process of revelation, I need to look at Joseph Smith and what did he know? What was he doing? And so I just started studying researching a lot of Joseph Smith things and finding things that often weren't the story that I had been told, right, that I'd grown up with. The story is more complex, in some ways it was just different. And I could in different ways, I could kind of make it fit together, right? But I got to a point several years into this process when I couldn't make things fit anymore, without feeling like I was trying way too hard to force them to fit.
So you mean
a lot of dissonance?
Oh, okay. That's what I was going to ask is, so you're coming across these things that you could no longer just be like, you know what, I still have my testimony. I'll figure it out someday maybe, or there was a reason behind it.
Well, I even had questions about the validity of religious experience because I encountered one thing that I studied the origins also of Mormon fundamentalism, like the polygamous groups. And people in these different groups would bear their testimonies of their group and its leader, and I started thinking, well, they seem really sure in their testimony of their thing, what makes me sure that my experiences are really valid, and so I started relying less and less on, I wanted to ground my faith in demonstrable, data, facts, empirical data that I could perceive intellectually, and for a while I thought that I had my faith grounded in that way. And then a few things that I'd been kind of relying on in my faith, I saw had other explanations, or they weren't as reliable as they thought. And my faith just rather quickly, it had been sort of shrinking for a while. It just suddenly imploded, And I stayed active for a while. I thought the church was a very good thing. I wasn't like a lot of people who just they lose their faith and they think what was I doing in that cult? And and there's something called the Recovery from Mormonism Board, RFM, at exmormon.org. And there are a lot of people there who just like, they're really angry. I didn't feel like that. I did feel disillusioned. There was a lot that I was frustrated with. And actually, the longer that I stayed active after I wasn't believing, kind of the more that tension built up for me, and the more I was getting frustrated, I didn't know what to do with that. But eventually, I came to like a breaking point. I stopped going to church. And by now I had real questions about God. I had questions about like the evidence for God, but also things like I knew of very specific instances of suffering, like the suffering of children, that just, I thought, how can I square this with God's love, And so I had real questions even about God. I became super disillusioned with Joseph Smith as I went on. As through all this, I continued my research, and I had developed an explanatory model. Like we may not think of it this way, but to understand anything, we develop a model of it. And usually we don't think we're developing a model because we think we're just seeing reality exactly the way that it is, right? We're not. We're constructing models, and they may be good models, they may be bad models of reality, right? Or better and worse models, right? But my model of Joseph Smith had come to be that Joseph Smith was an opportunist. So all the things that a lot of people say, right? Like money, sex, power, right? Like that was the lens that I had come to start using for Joseph Smith. And so my question for anything that Joseph Smith did, my question that I was asking about it was, what was in it for him, right? Well, I mean, if you take anybody and ask that question about everything that they do, and you could probably if you have a cynical model of people, you can probably come up with a lot of ways of seeing, well, yeah, but he just did that because, he wanted to yes, this was like a good action externally, but maybe he just did it because he wanted the praise of other people, or whatever. Right. Anyway, I pursued that model for a while, and it was more complex than that. Right. I made a lot of discoveries in early Mormon history and things, relating to Joseph Smith and like the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Even my project on the lost 116 pages of the Book of Mormon started while I wasn't a believer,
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It started while I didn't believe. Which is interesting because it was actually ended up being part of my coming back. Right?
Okay.
I never stopped digging. And, Christine Haglund is well known in like Mormon studies and was the editor of Dialogue. She gave a talk once where she said that her father taught them that the answer to problems created by knowledge is more knowledge. I think sometimes we look at problems created by knowledge and we seem to think the answer is less knowledge, right? Like we want to sort of deny certain historical data that have been uncovered, well, we need less of that, sweep that under the rug, right? And actually, my experience ended up being the opposite of that, and is what like Chris Haglund's father said, right? That as I kept digging, eventually my digging led me to actually a very different view of Joseph Smith. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'd come to the point where I was an atheist. And I was extremely disillusioned with Joseph Smith. I had been so devout as a Latter-day Saint, and I'd been so kind of inspired by Joseph Smith that to be just deeply disillusioned with him was crushing for me, And and it made me think that religion could be used really cynically, right, to manipulate people and so on. I felt like I had believed in the restoration, but I didn't think Joseph Smith had believed in it, right?
Okay.
And so I felt like I'd been sort of like played, right? And so, but like I said, I continued the research. I got to a point where I felt like I needed to leave the church, like officially. And this is funny. I through all this journey up to this point, I'd never felt that way, you know. But I felt like because I was an atheist, for one thing, I felt like there was no place in the church for an atheist, you know. I really wanted to contribute to the community. I had this innate desire to contribute. I felt like this was my group. These were my people, Latter-day Saints. But I felt like I didn't have anything to contribute because I'd think about my projects and I would think, well, I mean, these things put Joseph Smith in such a bad light that this is a contribution to Mormonism the way that, like, you know, laying sticks of dynamite under the foundations of a building is a contribution to the building, right? Like it doesn't matter if I want to contribute to the community, I can't. And so I left. I left, right? Like I put in a letter, like resigning my membership, right? In that letter, I actually tried to write it in such a way that I sort of like bore my anti-testimony in the letter. I like gave reasons why I didn't believe and said flat out, like, I'm believing because it's not true. And I even crafted the letter with the thought that, like, you know, I realized at the time that, like, the main people who were interested in Mormon history were Mormons. I did Mormon history, and so I thought, you know, maybe I will want to be back in the church just to be able to, like, talk to Mormons about Mormon history. And I thought, I need to bar myself from being able to do that. So I'm going to write this letter in such a way that they will never let me back in the church.
Wow.
Because I will raise so many issues that I would never be able to, like, explain all those ishes.
Wow.
If I tried to go back in the church. So I
want to
put
read
a number
that
of issues.
Do you have a copy somewhere?
I do.
Yeah. Oh, you do.
And I'll get to that. But, like, so I was out of the church officially for several years, 5. Actually, I hand-delivered my letter to the bishop where I was living on Pioneer Day, 2005.
Wow. Pioneer Day.
Certainly symbolic.
It's
but,
cool.
When I got a letter telling me that my name had been removed from the records of the church, I thought it would feel liberating, because up to that time, it had felt that way. I felt like I was doing something big. Once I got the letter telling me that I was no longer a member of the church, I actually felt really deflated. I felt bad. I felt like I'd cut myself off from the only real community that I'd ever known. I felt like I thought about my decision to be baptized when I was 8 years old. And I knew then that I was making a decision to follow Jesus. And I thought, why would I want to undo that? You know? And so I felt bad, but I thought, well, there's no going back now. I've made dang sure of that, you know? Plus, you can stay in the church if you have believed, but you no longer believe. And if you're a member, but you've lost your faith. But if you want to join the church and you don't believe, like, they kind of want you to believe in order to join the church. Yeah. That's a problem, right? So I thought, well, it doesn't matter. It's all done, right? So I started this period in my life that I call a kind of wandering in the wilderness spiritually, right? There's a New Testament phrase that Paul uses, like, without God in the world, right? I tried to live really meaningfully. I still had things that gave me a sense of meaning, but I thought that ultimately, as an atheist, everything that I cared about would be destroyed, would be gone, right? Everything was ultimately tinged, to say the very least, with sadness. And I still wanted some kind of spirituality, though. And so one day I was reading Skeptic magazine, which is Michael Shermer is the editor. It's like it's what it sounds like. It's like part of the skeptical movement. These people are skeptical of religion. They're skeptical of like everything supernatural, right? And I was reading in Skeptic magazine, and there was an ad for a book called Biocosm that the ad said that it gave a meaning behind the universe without an appeal to the supernatural. I was like,
interesting.
This sounds like something for me, because I want there to be some larger meaning that I'm part of, but I didn't believe in anything supernatural. So I like checked the book out and started reading it, and it gave like physics stuff about like the origins of the universe and how fine-tuned the universe is for the existence of life. And I knew that the universe was fine-tuned for the existence of life. So in other words, like the fundamental constants of gravity and other forces of the universe exist within like this really tiny, narrow band that they have to be in order for anything to live in the universe. That if they were just like a like 1 billionth part, different this direction or that direction, no living creatures would be here, And I thought that I knew how fine the fine tuning was, and I thought that I had an explanation. And I read this book, and it just blew me away because it showed using like really heavyweight physicists and other scientists that like the fine tuning was like on the order of like 1 in 10 to the 200th power. Like if the fundamental laws of the universe were chosen at random, that would be the likelihood of there being life on Earth, right, or life in the universe. And then the explanations that I'd had for fine tuning as an atheist, the guy just shredded. Like he even used Richard Dawkins, arguments from Richard Dawkins to help him shred those arguments, which was totally unexpected for me, right? And so then I was like really excited to read the rest of the book. Well, what's the answer, right? Like, how did the universe come to be so fine-tuned that for life that we could be here and I could be reading this book, right? And his argument ended up being that our distant descendants fine-tuned the universe for the existence of life. Our distant descendants. So he said time is a closed loop, and like our society will advance into some great civilization that will be able to like engineer like the end of the universe such that like it will like restart, like, or that it will have started rather in the past, like like in this way that we can be here. And I'm like, this doesn't explain anything. This doesn't make any sense, right? And I thought he thinks this is more likely than God. Like I hadn't believed in God, but I didn't think God was more unlikely than this, right?
Yeah.
And so suddenly the guy created this massive problem for me in this book, and then he hadn't given me any good answer. He'd taken away some of my arguments as an atheist. He hadn't given me anything real to replace them with. So I started wondering, is there like a mind behind the universe? Why am I here? What's going on, And then there were other kind of steps along this journey, right, where I started re-examining some of the life experiences that I'd had, like an experience one day when I was 18 and I had left the church archives and I was going to the bus stop to head home, right? I had like a voice in my mind, like a thought warning me about a certain thing that ended up like saving my life, where I would have been like plowed down by a 2.5 ton car, right? Like a giant old Buick. Like they don't make cars this big anymore, right? But like, I had thought later on in life that I'd come up with an explanation for that, right? And then I started thinking about it more, and I was like, actually, no, my explanation. I was living in Salt Lake again. I was walking past the spot where this had happened and thinking about this experience all the time. and eventually realizing that I couldn't explain that one either, right? And so I thought, so there's a mind behind the universe, and this mind like cares about me, has like actually saved my life. So there's a God, you know? And so I started trying to figure out, well, what, if there's a God, like what religion should I be? And I actually attached myself to a beautiful, expansive faith called the Baha'i faith, that really just emphasizes like what they call the oneness of humankind. And I could talk about that a lot because it's really cool. But I had only, as a Baha'i, Baha'is don't talk a lot about the afterlife. They certainly believe in one, and I think there actually is a lot of Baha'i teaching about the afterlife, but I didn't really encounter it. So I had like a really vague sense of life after death. And then calamity struck. My younger brother, Charles, who was 25, just suddenly died. Oh, and I talked with him the night before. He was just like the best guy in the world, right? And I just was, the whole family, we were destroyed. And at his viewing, it was the saddest thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. There wasn't anybody there who wasn't completely torn apart. And, I saw my brother's body laid out there, and I thought, this is the last time I'm going to see my brother, because I thought maybe I would encounter him in some sort of ethereal way, like some sort of mind, we would just be minds or something. And, but I wouldn't see him in a body. I wouldn't like hear his voice. I wouldn't see like his mannerisms that really like expressed like the kind, amazing person that he was. And it really started me searching again. I started thinking a lot more about life after death, and I started thinking a lot more about, I had attached myself to the faith that I then was attached to because its teachings were so expansive and beautiful, but I hadn't been really certain, like, was this a revelation from God or not, And so I started really, like, thinking about different religions and thinking about, like, the concept of a resurrection, right? Because, like, was that true? Because Baha'is don't believe in a resurrection, right? And could I actually encounter my brother again as like the whole person that he was, right? And there was kind of a series of like providential events in my life where a good friend had given me, bought me some books. He offered to buy me some books that I wanted. And I bought one called The Resurrection. I got one called The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. Really read about the New Testament evidence on the resurrection and read Wright's historical arguments arguing that the resurrection was Christ's resurrection was a real thing. And I started really considering that and thinking, feeling compelled by this. He argues that to make sense of the data of the New Testament and early Christianity, there had to be at least two things: that the tomb had to be empty, and the disciples had to see Christ. They had to see, someone. They had to see what they took to be the risen Christ, right? But if you take these two things together, well, why was the tomb empty, and why were these people seeing Jesus, right? Then it makes a good case for, well, because like I know something that could explain both those things. He rose, right? Like God raised him. And since I already believed in God, I believe that God could, and that God was involved in our lives. I believe God could perform miracles. And so I concluded that, Christ had been resurrected. And then that had all kinds of implications for me. And I I accepted Christ. And I remember thinking about it as I was like walking on like South Temple to my home that evening after I'd really let all this sink in. And I just felt wave after wave of peace come over me. It was like a peace. It wasn't peace like the absence of distress. It was peace like a palpable presence, right? Like so thick you could cut it with a knife, right? And I just felt God's love, and the phrase from Paul, the peace that passes understanding, came to my mind. And so I was a Christian again now, and I don't know, I kind of looked into like different churches. I started remembering that reading the Book of Mormon, I started remembering that one of the things earlier in my life that helped me feel closest to Christ was reading the Book of Mormon. And so I thought, maybe I'll start reading the Book of Mormon. Now, mind you, at the time, I perfectly certain that Joseph Smith had written it, and he'd written it as an opportunist, right? He didn't even believe in it, what it was saying. But I thought, whatever he thought, wherever he was getting these ideas, like, there's something substantive here, and it's really helped me. It's borne good fruit in my life, so I'm going to try reading it. So I did. I started reading it, and this seemed to really be helpful to me spiritually. And then I got really confused. I was like, what am I doing? Like, why am I reading the Book of Mormon when I know that, right, that like Joseph Smith like wrote this, and like he didn't even believe in it, and but I'm trying to follow Christ, and I'm certain that he's real, that's real. And so I just thought, I'm just going to kind of, to use the proverbial language, like sort of put this on the shelf for right now, And then months later, not that long, but months later, I was doing a paper. I was writing a paper actually for a graduate course that I was taking. I was writing a paper on the first vision. And it was I was arguing that Joseph Smith's first vision was his initiation as a seer. Now, I didn't think at this time they actually had a first vision, but I thought there was a narrative of the first vision, and the point of the narrative was partly to show that how he had obtained powers as a seer.
Okay.
Right.
Cool.
Like, it's his first vision, so it's the first time he has like spiritual sight or second sight, right? But there were other things that I could piece together that made more sense of this. And so as I was doing this, I had also been working on figuring out things that were in the lost 116 pages using the sources that, some of which I talked about in the other episode. And things started clicking like crazy. Like, I started seeing how, as I talked about in the other episode, like the brother of Jared on the Mount was actually like a whole temple text related to the endowment, that the story of Mosiah the First from getting the interpreters, right, given by Joseph Smith Sr., was also like very much an endowment text. And I started seeing that aspects of the first vision were closely related to the endowment. And up until this point, I had thought that Joseph Smith didn't know anything about the Nauvoo endowment until he became a Freemason in 1842. So to find that, like, in the 1820s, and even at the very beginning of the 1820s, you've already got like endowment elements there, was just like mind-bending for me, especially as I started looking at the complexity of what I was finding and thinking that some of the structure of the endowment was already implicit in this vision that Joseph was claiming when he's like, in the middle, like when he's just a young teenager, right? So beginning of the 1820s. And I thought, but he doesn't institute the endowment until he's like 36 or whatever, right? Like, how many like 14, 15-year-old kids are like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make up a story about a vision that I had. And that vision is actually going to have the seeds in it of like this ritual that I want to enact later when I start a religion. But I'm going to wait to start that. I'm going to wait to enact that ritual for like 20 some odd years. Like when you're 14 or 15 years old, 20 years is an eternity, right?
This arbitrary age that I'm going to be.
You do
36.
not have this long-range life plan at that point.
Way.
Right?
I'm 27, and I don't know what I'm going to do when I'm 36.
Right?
I don't even know what I'm doing tomorrow.
Right. So, like, it just, as the more I looked at the complexity of what I was seeing, the power of what I was seeing, and so on, the less sense it made with the model of Joseph Smith that I was using, of Joseph Smith as opportunist, right? I also started seeing other things that, I mean, I've got a presentation I did at the FAIR conference in 2019, I guess, just last year.
Okay.
That also talks about why I came back to the church, but it talks,
cool.
It develops this aspect more specifically about the first vision as an endowment.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. And it talks about how the evidence that I see that when Joseph Smith comes back from the first vision, he tells us, he talks to his mother. He's exhausted. From this experience, he leans up against the fireplace. His mother asks him, what is the matter? He says, it is all right, mother. I'm well enough off. I've learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. Full stop. Like, that's all he tells her. You've just seen God, and all you have to say is, your religion's not true, right? Like, so the thing is, Joseph Smith was only telling people the things about the first vision that were relevant to them at the time, right? That's all his mother needed to know as far as he was concerned at the time was Presbyterian church isn't true, you know? Joseph Smith doses the first vision out in little doses to people across time. He never gives the full story. We can look at this story with his mother and we can think, well, he didn't tell her the whole story, but he told us the whole story. What makes you think he told us the whole story, right? I think, actually, if you look at his various accounts and the fact that he gives some details in certain accounts but not in other accounts, the details all fit together into a larger narrative, right? But he's never telling one person on a single occasion the whole thing, right? So you look at, I realized that there are aspects that he was holding back, right? And if you look at various accounts that he gives hints sometimes at further aspects of his experience. So he talks about, in one account, how I'm trying to remember his words. Those will come to me in just a sec. In another account, he says, I think it's his official account, when I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, gazing up into heaven, right? And then in the other account that I'm thinking of, he said, my mind was taken away from the objects which surrounded me, right? So we are used to picturing Joseph Smith, he's there in the grove, and he's just like looking, and he sees the objects around him, he sees the trees and everything, and then like he sees, right, like this descent, right, this theophany, right? Like he's seeing all these things at the same time, and then like, you know, the vision is over and he just sees like the trees around him or whatever. That's not what he's describing, right? So he's actually describing, initially sees God's glory in the trees and so on, but then like eventually he doesn't see the things surrounding him anymore. It's like he's transported, at least his mind, right, like someplace else, right?
Whoa.
And when at the end of his experience, it's like he's like coming to again, right? So there's a sermon in Nauvoo, and again, I developed this at greater length in that video. There's a sermon in Nauvoo where I argue from what he's saying that he's suggesting, he's talking about the first vision, but he talks about also like gazing into the heavens, gazing into heaven and what you see there. And I argue that he's connecting the two. He's saying that as part of his first vision, he saw into heaven, right? So in other words, the first vision is a two-part experience. It's not just like God comes down to the grove. It's then God lifts Joseph up to heaven.
Whoa.
Okay? And so
okay.
I realize that this has all kinds of implications, because if you think about it, that's a nutshell of the entire plan of redemption, right? So the early Christians had this formula that they gave: God became man in order that man might become God, right? So right, like as the Book of Mormon says, Abinadi predicts in King Benjamin, right? God himself shall come down, right, and take on flesh, right? But then what's the point of that? Well, God's coming down to our level to lift us up to God's level, right? So we can be like God, you know? And so I was realizing, wait, that idea was implicit already at the beginning of the restoration, like the idea of like theosis or deification, right? That we can become like God. And this like powerful vision of like the plan of redemption. And I just like, it all just like blew me away, right? There's more, right? But it just like exploded my head. And
Because it's exploding my head right now. This is awesome.
I just like realized almost immediately as these things were coming together, like I am going back to the church.
Wow.
And it wasn't like, I still had some things to work out in my head before I like fully committed to that. But it was like a realization almost immediately, you know? So I initiated that process, and it was terrifying because when I went to leave the church, if you go to leave the church, there are so many resources online to tell you how to do it. Here's how to write your exit letter.
Oh my
right?
goodness.
And so on, you know, like here's a phone number of somebody at, you know, who handles the resignation letters at church headquarters. If you have any trouble, call him, right? Like here's a sample letter. Here are legal considerations. Here's like, you know, all these things.
Wow.
When I went to come back, I couldn't find anything. All I knew is I had to meet with church leaders. That was it. And so I contacted the local bishop who I didn't know, and I just talked with him. I had things to confess, right, from my time outside the church. He just listened so beautifully. And he told me, he said, afterward, he said, the Lord wants you back in his church. And he talked to the stake president about what needed to happen next. And the stake president said that we would have to revisit my letter.
No way.
So remember, I crafted that letter to keep myself from ever being able to come back because I didn't think I didn't think I would want to. And then later, I mean, I don't know. I thought, long story. But
is that a usual practice? Let's look back at your letter and...
I think so.
Wow.
I don't know.
Oh, no.
But so I went and found a copy of my letter, and then I cried. Because I remembered some of it, but I didn't remember all of it until I read it again.
5 years, right?
Mm-hmm. I cried, and I called up the bishop in a panic, and I said, they're never going to let me back into the church. And he told me, he said, son, if the church couldn't forgive, it couldn't be the Lord's church. And he had me take the discussions.
Was that fun, or was it kind of nail pulling or teeth pulling?
Actually, it was really cool. Like, I actually felt like I got more insight, even though, like, right before the bishop didn't want the missionaries to know that I used to be a member of the church because he didn't want them to leave anything out in the discussions. So immediately before they arrived, I moved my bookcases with every conceivable book on Joseph Smith and the origins of the church and the Book of Mormon. I moved those out of the hall because it suddenly occurred to me, they will be walking right through here. So I moved those into my room. But it ended up being really like edifying, you know?
Oh, cool.
And
I've always wondered what it'd be like from an investigator point of view.
It also was like a fascinating anthropological experience, right? Because I haven't been on one side of that. I haven't been on the missionary side. Then to be on the investigator side, right?
And this was only about 10 years ago, right? Uh-huh. From the time 2020.
Yeah.
Oh,
this
wow.
is 2010. Yeah, 2010. So less than 2 months after I first met with that bishop, actually I should say this. The bishop told me, I wondered how I was going to account for the things in my letter. I was terrified of this partly because I'm a better writer than I am speaker, right? And I thought, I carefully crafted that letter when I wrote it. And now I'm going to go through this, line by line in a meeting with my bishop and say, well.
On the spot.
Yeah, right? And so the bishop told me he felt inspired that I needed to write a new letter requesting admission back into the church, just like I'd written one to leave.
Cool.
And so I thought, this, right?
Yeah.
And so I wrote that second letter, and that second letter swallowed the first one whole, right?
Oh, cool.
And I met with the bishop and one of his counselors shortly afterward, and he asked me to read the letter to them out loud, which I did. And immediately afterward, he said that on behalf of the church, he wanted to extend to me an invitation to be baptized. And it was amazing, right? It was beautiful. And just because this episode's about faith crisis, there's something I should add that would be particularly apropos. So I was baptized on a Sunday, right? And one of the things I had wondered about when I decided to come back to the church is, would I be able to handle church? Because when I had left, when I'd stopped attending before I left, church had been driving me crazy. Everything about it, right? The comments people
can
made.
Relate. I'm right in that. That's me right now.
I can sympathize. So I came back to the church and I thought, this isn't like I remember. The people, since when did people make such good comments in church? It seemed like things had changed, over and over. And eventually I figured out the church couldn't have changed that much in 5 years. What changed had to be me, right? And so I went to church, these couple months, right, before I was going to be rebaptized. I was going to be rebaptized on this, Sunday. And so I went through all my church meetings, and the last meeting that day was elders quorum, right? So the final meeting of these 2 months of going to church before I get rebaptized, elders quorum, and we have this lesson on priesthood authority, and the teacher decides to have us do skits, right, to illustrate divine authority. So he has one guy do a skit where a couple guys do a skit where one guy is driving down the road, and another guy pulls him over and says, "Sorry, sir, I noticed you didn't properly fully stop at that stop sign, so I'm gonna give you this ticket," or whatever. But the guy who's stopping him is not actually a policeman, right? And so of course the drivers of the car is like, "Well, who are you to stop me? You don't have any authority to do this," right? So then then there's another skit, and there's another skit. So the last skit, right? So this is the very final thing that happens before I get at church, before I get rebaptized. There's this skit where this guy, he does a great job with the skit. He says the brothers, the Lord has given me this revelation that, the second coming is near, and as a test of our faith before the second coming, Lord wants us to go with our families up, to the top of Mount St. Helens and throw ourselves in, I guess he was picturing it as an active volcano, right? Throw ourselves in, throw our families in and ourselves, and he'll save us. And then everybody's laughing and laughing, right? And then one guy says, yeah, like we do that if anybody except the prophet told us to. And then another guy's like, yeah. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're not laughing about the same thing, because I'm laughing about the fact that this whole thing is completely bonkers, right? That we would ever do this.
Oh, no.
And you're laughing because it's the wrong guy telling us to do it, right?
Oh,
and I thought,
whoa.
I actually saw it as kind of like God has a sense of humor, and he wanted to let me know that the church that I was going back to wasn't completely different than the one that I thought I was leaving before, right? That there are weird authoritarian views, things like that, but I went back to the church, and, I was beautifully accepted back into the church, cool. Just beautifully. I'd been very involved in online discussion groups. I posted on one of them, the fair boards. There were like 200 people who came on to welcome me back to the church.
Oh,
right.
Cool.
And a year later, when I applied to have a restoration of temple blessings, priesthood blessings, when you have that restoration of blessings, they actually change your membership record so that it doesn't show your rebaptism date. It shows your original baptism date.
When you were 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So
that if you go to another ward, no one will ever know that you were out of the church unless you tell them. Right?
Cool.
So, and they read, anyway, so it's like a clean slate, right? So the church very much believes in forgiveness, and I experienced that.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm very grateful, and hopefully that helps anybody in our audience to hear that, or to watch Don give that story. And we are going to do a part 2 because there's more that Don and I want to talk about. And maybe this is a good length of an episode to stop. And next time we will release a part 2 where we, we talked about our stories and kind of personal stuff in this story. And then the next is we're going to talk about more faith crisis stuff and more kind of, what did you say earlier?
Well, kind of for me, kind of maybe things that I learned through my faith journey, and maybe things I think you wanted to ask, what would have helped me to know back then, and just kind of to give a little larger perspective. Cool. Because I think I didn't have a lot of perspective going into that journey, and I have a lot more now.
Cool. Okay. Yes. We are going to come back, and please subscribe so you can make sure that you're notified when the next episode comes back, when we have Don back. And like this video, so more videos like this and more videos from the channel can pop up into your recommended, and you can keep watching us forever and ever. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.